This is an amusing woodcut which picks up a theme which is mentioned in the pamphlet The World is Turned Upside Down from April 1646. For some people, the civil wars, revolution and then execution of King Charles I turned the world upside down. The biblical end of days and the end of the world as they knew it. Here we have a depiction of what an upside down world might look like. There are churches in the sky, fish flying in the sky, rabbits and rats chasing cats, a man pushed by a wheelbarrow, and a cart by a horse. In the centre there is a man standing on his hands, waving his legs like hands, and his head coming out of his groin. This is the physical equivalent of what the Leveller movement wanted to do politically to England. The intention of this lecture is to review the impact the radical groups had on society between 1625 and 1688 in regards to the confessional state. Knowledge-wise, you will be able to explain the impact of the radical groups. Skills-wise, you will analyse and evaluate the radical groups. And then behaviourally, you will consider elements of continuity and change. The outbreak of civil war in 1642 gave rise to radical ideas which were exacerbated by the execution of the king in 1649. These radical ideas were able to grow more to do with the breakdown of censorship than an increase in the amount of believers. Many ideas were promoted by the growth of millenarianism within the Puritan sects, again made possible by the decline in censorship during the war. Millenarian groups believed in the second coming of Jesus Christ. The fifth monarchists believed that the fifth kingdom, that of Jesus, was due to begin following the collapse of the monarchy, whereas the Muggletonians, Ludovic Muggleton and John Reeve, were convinced they had been chosen to prepare for the coming of Jesus. Nevertheless, it was not just religion these radical groups were concerned with. Many were concerned with political suffrage and democracy, especially the Levellers and their members in the New Model Army. The highest ranking Leveller was Thomas Rainsborough, who spoke for the Army Levellers against the ideas of the grandees, Cromwell and Ireton, at the Putney debates. Rainsborough, in 1647, said, "I think that the poorest he that is in England have a life to live as the greatest he, and therefore truly, sir, I think it's clear that every man that is to live under a government ought first by his own consent to put himself under that government, and I do think that the poorest man in England is not at all bound in the strict sense to that government that he had not a voice to put himself under." This is the very fundamental essence of democracy, that a state cannot control you if you have no input into that state being in power. He then justifies his view with logic about God, that God gave man reasons, and only God can take away that, not the state. The Levellers were political radicals. However, socially, their revolutionary nature is debatable. They called for the Commons to be the central body in the political system, the abolition of the House of Lords, and equality before the law and religious freedom. However, they did not call for equality in the franchise for voting, denying women and the poor the vote. Though Leveller women, like Catherine Chidley, were influential, they could be easily dismissed by Parliament, as she was in 1653 by the Bare Bones Parliament. No doubt the Levellers were successful. However, once the First and Second Civil Wars were over, the leaders were imprisoned and the Rump Parliament crushed them. Certainly they were very active between 1647 and 1649, and their legacy has influenced later democratic movements. And the late Tony Benn states that every generation must have the same debates as the Levellers. They also caused a conservative backlash by the gentry, such as Cromwell and Ireton, who wanted to protect their positions in society. Also, they were heavily divided over the cause, meaning no cohesive message. Plus, the fact they ignored women and the poor reduced their support base greatly. In 1650 London, a group known as the Ranters emerged. They argued those predestined to be saved by God were incapable of sin. This pushed the envelope on predestination. If all was already decided, then one's actions were sanctioned by God. Therefore, believing in immoral sexual behaviour, drinking, swearing and crime were legitimate. They were accused of drunken orgies, which was doubtful. However, these claims were believed, and by 1651 the Ranters' leaders were imprisoned. The Blasphemy Act of 1650 made sure the Ranters were effectively banned, and how far the Ranters were a powerful group is debatable. Anything written about them was written by their enemies, who used the fear created to push for a conservative backlash enforcing the state religion. The Rump Parliament was therefore able to use the fear of the Ranters to push acts through Parliament limiting religious toleration. The Diggers called themselves the True Levellers, and after the King's death saw laws created over the land were now invalidated, and set up rural communes for the poor on this now common land. The Diggers, set up by Gerald Winstanley in Weybridge, Surrey, grew very popular, and complaints were received, and they were interviewed by the leader of the New Model Army, Thomas Fairfax. They greatly upset Fairfax by refusing to remove their hats in his presence. When the Weybridge Diggers lost a court case to local landowners, they moved out of Weybridge. However, groups emerged in Northamptonshire and Buckinghamshire. They too met a similar fate. The views of the Diggers were based on ideas of common ownership of the means of production, in this case the land, equal compulsory education for boys and girls, and the abolition of the monarchy and the House of Lords. The Diggers were more revolutionary than the Levellers, and because of this less people were interested. Their ideas also dealt with agricultural communities, but faced opposition from farmers and landowners. The mid-17th century was clearly too conservative, and the Diggers were too radical and revolutionary for the 17th century. Seekers were loosely organised groups in the 1620s who promoted the internal light and word of God. Therefore churches and clergy were not needed. Seekers, unlike the Levellers and Diggers, who threatened hierarchy and deference, challenged the orthodox view and that God existed within everyone. These new seeker sects began to deny religious and moral control or authority outside of the individual conscience or inner voice. George Fox, founder of the Quakers, took his belief in the inner voice of God to the nation. Preachers appeared gathering their adherents with success, and the wandering preachers, such as James Naylor, could be arrested and face harsh punishments. It is estimated by the early 1660s some 35,000 Quakers existed in England. However, the Quaker Act of 1662 saw a readjustment of Quaker ideology. Nevertheless, the activities of groups like the Ranters had ensured a conservative reaction which threatened to destroy them all. In 1625, England was a confessional state. Although uniformity was not enforced or in many ways enforceable, the idea of a national religion supported by government and enforced by law was widely entrenched. Those who opposed this idea were so few to almost be non-existent. Even those who could not conform accepted the punishment meted out on them and paid their fines and even left the country. Those who objected did so not because they disagreed with the idea of uniformity, but rather disliked the version being imposed on them. By 1640, those individuals questioning the idea of a confessional state were numerous and organised to bring about the collapse of state authority in religion. The Civil War gave those individuals the conditions to explore and debate alternatives to the Laudian Church of England. Though these groups never received widespread support, their debates led to a change in the role of the monarchy. The idea of uniformity was challenged, as well as the divine right of kings. The Restoration attempted to re-establish the confessional state of prior to the Civil War. However, the interregnum had strengthened the opposition to a position where they could not be eradicated. Therefore, the debates continued and concluded that political loyalty did not depend upon agreement over religion. These were the embryonic stirrings of a secular state, where government does not concern itself with the private matter of religion. It is for this reason that many who opposed James II did so. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 saw the monarchy change forever, with a king subject to law. Parliament continued to argue with the monarch's place in church and government. However, the clergy had shifted. Some stated the congregation had no role in civil government and should be formed by the people. Daniel Whitby, an Armenian priest, wrote that no single individual can claim to rule by divine right because God never intended it. Times had changed. The intention of this lecture was to review the impact the radical groups had on society between 1625 and 1688 in regards to the confessional state. Knowledge-wise, you will now be able to explain the impact of the radical groups. Skills-wise, you will now analyse and evaluate the radical groups in the associated material, and then behaviourally consider elements of continuity and change in the associated material. Now complete the associated material.